thing, man. It's OT, brother. The legend, the first black quarterback, starting quarterback to win a Super Bowl ring. And we're doing this to honor and they show love to our boy Jaden Daniels and the Washington Commanders. We
Yep.
are not trying to be disrespectful. I personally will start calling them the Redskins. Redskins, their original name, moving forward right now. The Washington
In
Redskins.
this segment.
They were
Yeah,
a
because
dynasty, bro. They were a
yeah,
dynasty,
well,
from what I heard.
and
So
this is the name, right? This is the
that's
name of the
the name.
team that he
Oh,
played
yeah,
for. We're
yeah.
all happy that they've moved past that. It's sort of
Mhm.
part of the arc of justice throughout North America and all that type of thing. But
Yeah.
like in telling this story, we're going to talk about some other levels of racism and whatnot. We all acknowledge that DC's, name the Redskins was unpopular with certain segments, obviously Native Americans, and others who have, value social justice and whatnot. It just seemed unseemly as the years went by. But
Mhm.
part of the theme of what we're talking about in with Mr. Williams today
Mhm.
is just how late into the previous century, some old remnants of racist structures still existed, and it's a big part of what Mr. Williams went up against.
Yeah.
But I'm really glad we've introduced Doug Williams as our topic for overtime this week because he certainly impressed me, stood out to me when I was a young man. He came onto the scene just as I was becoming an NFL fan. So
Mhm.
I learned about him sort of on the go. I learned more about him obviously once I was in college when he was doing his thing with the Redskins, and I
Mhm.
certainly learned a lot more about him in researching him for this segment. I had seen his documentaries on HBO previously to this, so I've always
Mhm.
found him to be an inspirational figure. He is really kind of the last of a generation of football players prior to free agency, where like their character was a big part of their game. Because like not everybody was getting a ton of money and whatnot. So you'll see that as we talk about it. So Doug Williams comes from a place called Zachary, Louisiana. And Zachary, Louisiana is about it's less than 20 miles north of oh shoot, the name is avoiding me right now. Anyways,
So,
it's a college town just north of New Orleans. Right, that's shameful that I'm forgetting that right now. But anyways, so he was not that far from a big town, a college town. But this guy did not get running water on the property he grew up in until he was 14.
yeah.
This guy was born in 1955. That means that almost 1970, his family did not have
Wow.
running water. They asked him
What?
how is that? Yeah, like third world in
Did they go to
America,
the river? Did they go to the river or something?
they had an
Mhm.
outhouse and they would have had
Oh,
a pump, right? Like
okay.
just like you would see in not even in the West Indies anymore, like very few places in
That's
Jamaica
like so damn, yeah.
or even in West Africa. I mean, like we've come a long way in 50 years. A lot of places that, it's not quite that primitive, but they would have had a well and an
Yeah.
outhouse. And somebody asked him along the way, like, how the hell did your arm get that strong? And he jokingly, not jokingly, told him that no, that his job in the morning as one of the younger kids was to take the chimney bucket out to the outhouse. And so, of
Wow.
course, he says, like, you don't want to slop that on yourself, right? Obviously. So he said that he would carry it like this. So
Yeah.
for years, he said that was
Bruh.
part of what made his. It's like Jerry Rice talking about how his dad was a bricklayer and that he toughened up and roughened up his hands and learned how to catch one handed because his dad would toss him bricks.
Yeah.
So
I didn't know
these
that.
great, yeah, these great football stories. So yeah, that's how he grew up, man. Like very, very humble origins. But he was 6'4", which was extraordinarily tall for a quarterback at that time. Most of your number one quarterbacks back in the league were back in the day in the NFL were about 6'1". That was considered sort of the ideal, right? Nowadays we consider 6'4" to be ideal, right? But so he
Mhm.
was at the advent of sort of that change, that idea of a big quarterback, right? And if he ran, like linebackers were like this guy's almost my size because remember linebackers weren't nearly as big as they are now. right?
Oh,
Linebackers back then were regularly under 300 pounds, not over, right?
yeah.
So, anyways, right? So, try to imagine the time that he comes into the NFL, 1978, 79, right? At that time, there are no black GMs and no black coaches. Why is this significant? It's because the position of quarterback is a little bit different than every other position on the field because you're quasi management in a way. You're the face of the organization, which means you make a lot of public appearances. It means you have a lot of conversations with the coach and even the GM on occasions. The owner would like to take you out sometimes and put you on his arm to photo ops and charity events and things like that. So being like a black quarterback, a big hulk of
Yes,
a
sir.
man, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily sit well with everybody, right? In that old school, as late as 1978. Okay, we're not talking like 100 years ago. And this is part of our story too. Here's a little, I got so much factoids for you. Actually, 100
Yeah.
years ago, when the NFL first started, its first season, 1920, 21, two
Okay.
black players, two black players.
What?
They were the first players ever to play professional NFL football. But of course, what did the what did the NFL do in 1922? Right?
Come on, man. Cut him
I ain't
probably. They
lying.
were like,
You didn't see another.
yeah,
You didn't see another black player until the 40s. And the only reason that was true back then was because they wanted to transfer a team to LA and play in the Coliseum. And the Coliseum received a shitload of public money. So black people in LA said, listen, you want our tax dollars? We want to see a black player on the field. And LA had to
wow.
do that. And the NFL allowed it. And that was their Jackie Robinson moment. Things got better from there. But they tried.
Wow.
Yeah. So, anyways, it's hard to nail down the first black players in the NFL because it's like a moving thing, right? Due to
Like they be
circumstances.
in and out. Oh, damn. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and also too,
Right.
there's the AFL, right? Running
That's
parallel to the
different league.
NFL. And
Yes.
as early as 1968, there was a black quarterback in Denver named Marlon Briscoe. Now,
Okay.
Marlon Briscoe um, got converted to QB like we hear about. It's basically how it went. And again, it was racism, right? He went out there, he was fourth on the depth chart. First guy got injured. The reliable guy got injured. Next two guys were very mediocre white men, right? So finally, in desperation, they got him on there. His first pass was 22 yards down the field for completion, and he drove him to a touchdown. Ran for X amount of yards. You're seeing the prototype, right?
Yes. Yes.
The owner didn't fire him, but just without giving him a reason, told him that, you know, Bubba
Yeah.
over here
Fuck.
was
Get out
taking
of here.
over. Blonde haired,
Bruh.
blue eyed Bubba was taking. And the reason is that they were getting mail from Denver fans saying, we don't want him at quarterback. We'll give up our
What?
tickets. We will give up our tickets. We will watch a losing product with a blonde, blue eyed quarterback more happily and more enjoyably than winning with this guy.
Oh,
So
the
what did this guy
racism was
do?
that deep. The
This
racism
guy,
was that
this
deep.
guy didn't say a word. This guy didn't say a
Yeah.
word. Went to Buffalo, got converted to wide receiver, instantly had 1,000-yard season, got traded to the Miami Dolphins in 72, won 2 rings. The only thing he doesn't have is the Hall of Fame. So
Wow.
he got his
Wow.
revenge, right? Like just a pure
Very
football
good.
player. Could have played cornerback too. So black
Yeah.
men, African Americans getting their respect in the NFL really took until the 1970s.
Mm.
And Doug Williams was at the forefront of that. Just one other guy to mention that preceded him, so we can get the timeline right, and that's Joe
Absolutely.
Gilliam. Coincidentally, I sent an article to you
Yeah, you
about him
sent me the
earlier this
article.
week.
Yeah.
He
That's
is
what sparked
considered
this thinking. Yeah. Yeah.
he's considered to be the first NFL starting quarterback. He won the job in training camp.
Mhm.
He held the job for about 6 games, and then the same thing came up again. Terry Bradshaw was drafted 2 years earlier as the number one overall pick in the first round. Number one, number one. Blonde
Wow.
haired, blue eyed, out of Louisiana. This was because Pittsburgh was so terrible in the 60s. They had the number one pick. They grabbed Terry Bradshaw, but he was terrible. The first 2, 3 years, he just could not get it together. Because remember, too, like quarterback was different back then. 50% completion was considered like good. right?
Yes.
So, anyways, but he
Yeah.
was throwing way more interceptions than TDs. So Gilliam won the job outright, and you'll never get this guess this factoid.
What's that?
Bradshaw, after seeing him play for those first 4 or 5 games, actually went to
Mm.
Chuck Noll and said, "I've seen the future. I'm not in it. Please trade me." Chuck Noll said no.
So Terry asked to be traded?
Asked for a
What?
trade. He was so sure he was out of a
Whoa.
job. And when I
Whoa.
And when I watched the video, I actually feel robbed because this guy had the sweetest spiral I ever saw. Man, it was super, super good until I see Doug Williams. But like, just
Yeah.
amazing. You can see this guy was just as good or better than Bradshaw, right? But he didn't get to go to, like he didn't have all those advantages of being a number one pick and all that type of stuff. He was taken in the 11th round. They don't even have an 11th round anymore.
I don't even do that
Anyways,
no more. Yeah.
Anyways, unfortunately,
Mm.
unfortunately, it being the 70s, right? Like there's a lot of drug use. So he fell out. He actually lost. Bradshaw said Gilliam gave me back the job because he was just living like just he couldn't handle the Michael Irving lifestyle well enough to hold on to the job. He started missing meetings and stuff. And at first, you have some people
Wow.
questioning it, saying like he wasn't necessarily worse. But the thing is, like for a guy like Chuck Noll, you can't have that type of slackness, right? It's just not going to work, right? If people know you're using drugs, they're like, okay, that's a line we can't cross, right? Like uppers and
You
downers
have
from
to be
the from
borderline. You have to be borderline Lawrence Taylor or Irving in his prime.
right,
That,
right.
like, which is 1% of the less than 1%. You know what
And
I mean?
back then, yeah, and back then that wasn't like a great thing. But also too, Gilliam had pain. Gilliam says the story. He says the first time he tried heroin was to kill pain, right? Like opiates. You hear about people getting hooked on heroin nowadays, but they started with opiates. Like anyway, so there
Very
might have been
common
some
these
of
days.
that.
Bad
But the
things.
whole point is
Yeah.
that he didn't seek out help. He didn't give up running around having fun, right? But I mean, if you watch Cocaine Cowboys, like they talk
It was
specifically
great.
about the Pittsburgh offensive and defensive lines coming to the guy's house, doing cocaine till 4 in the morning, and then going and winning the Super Bowl the next day. So it's not like he was an outlier on that damn team, right?
It's probably
But
the
he couldn't
norm.
handle it. And so
Wow.
Bradshaw got the job back, won 2 Super Bowls. Gilliam's got both rings, right?
Well, yeah.
But
Oh, I didn't know he had both rings.
he
Wow.
yeah, oh, he was on the team still, but he reverted to the
Yeah.
backup. But anyway, so he is credited with being the Jackie Robinson of the NFL, first black quarterback, so to speak, right? First
Yeah.
African American to play the position of quarterback, because there are not two positions, black quarterback and quarterback, right?
Just
um,
quarterback. You know what I mean? And then
but
respect.
that's
I
further
didn't
in
know
our
that.
story. So that's the timeline. So Doug Williams is not the first, but he's probably the first guy to really blow it up and really succeed with it. So he goes into Tampa Bay after coming fourth in the Heisman, by the way. He played at Grambling for a guy named Eddie Robinson, the legend of historically black university football, right? Guy had
Yeah, for
more wins
sure.
than Bear Bryant, right?
Mm.
Right. So there was like debate in the 80s too in Sports Illustrated about like, should this guy be considered a legend like Bear Bryant? He had more victories than
Yeah,
Bear Bryant.
the crazy part is I did hear about Eddie Robinson and how he had been winning so much, but
Oh,
it's
yeah.
because he's at a HBCU, didn't value it as much. So
Right.
the racism was that deep, crazy enough, even
But,
beyond the town. You know what I
right.
mean?
Okay. But Gilliam, the guy we just talked about, came from an
Yeah.
HBCU. John
Ooh,
Stallworth, HBCU. Jerry Rice, HBCU. Right.
HBCU, real talk. Yeah,
Okay, and there's
right.
more Pittsburgh guys. There's more Pittsburgh guys on the defense from HBCUs. Like I think
Oh,
Mean Joe
oh,
Green. I'm pretty sure Mean Joe Green. Like Pittsburgh
yeah.
scouted the HBCUs, right? And
Walter Payton
anyways,
too. Mhm.
so Doug Williams comes out of Grambling, which is a running school, but Eddie Robinson trusted him to throw up to 38 touchdowns, one away from the NCAA Division One record because he trusted Doug Williams. So that tells you again how special he was even in college. Gets
Mm.
drafted. You would think he would be number one with Tampa Bay being as poor as they were, but they actually traded out of the number one position and were still able to grab Doug Williams at number 17 because nobody else was scouting him. Only Joe Gibbs, who was the offensive coordinator for McKay, the coach in Tampa Bay, scouted him. And he considered him
Mm.
the best quarterback in the draft, right? Good old Joe Gibbs,
Oh,
right? Joe Gibbs comes back in our story later. So, anyways, yeah. So he comes into Tampa, wins 4 games for a winless team right away. But he gets his jaw broken mid-season, so he can't continue. So the first season's kibosh. Wins 10 games the next season. This is a team that their first season was 1976, an expansion team. Takes them
Mm,
to the playoffs, comes within 1 game
mm.
of the right to get beaten up by the Pittsburgh Steelers in 79-80, right? So, but LA beats them. But are you kidding me? Right? Like that's how you win, right?
That's
So
huge. Yeah.
yeah, so he comes in, he's trucking people and all that type of stuff. Um,
Mm,
and he comes in there, and but all of this, what's happening to him at the same time?
mm.
Incredible things this guy went through. This guy's going through the all the hate mail. He's getting all the hate mail because he's the starting quarterback. He's the face of the franchise. He's all these things that we talked about earlier that 10 years previous guys just simply could not handle.
Yeah.
And so Arthur Ashe described it best once to Michael Wilbon. He said, being a black man in America is like having a second full time job because you have to do
Mm,
so many things on top of being excellent, twice as good
yes.
as like the next guy.
Yeah.
Like it's like having a second full time job with all the things you have to put up with and
Oh,
absorb and all that type of thing. It caused him to have a panic attack on the field at one point. The guy fell out. The guy got yeah, he fell out on the
oh
field.
boy.
And he came back, right? But like there was so much stress on the guy because he didn't share it with everybody. Because why? He's an old school tough guy from rural Louisiana. That's why, right? It's very stoic in places like that. So he was becoming a big star for the organization. But already you know what's happening, right? Upstairs in
Yeah.
the head office, Hugh Corneros, I think his name was. He was the owner. He wasn't really liking the fact that he probably thought it was an interesting experiment. He might get some good press out of it. But all of a sudden, this guy was like becoming the face of the franchise. He didn't
Wow.
like this, right? So again, yeah. So by the end of his rookie contract, he's the 54th highest paid QB, even though he's like top 5 in the league, right? The
Nice.
man asked for 875. They offered 400. He came down to 6. Figured
Oh,
compromise, right?
okay.
Nope. They did not
Oh,
re-sign him. They did not re-sign him. So he
wow.
has to. He had to sit out the season.
Wow.
His high school sweetheart, his wife, died in that time. So he was going through all kinds of incredible,
Personal.
changes in his life. He goes to the USFL. He blows up in the USFL. So like throws for like 3,500 yards per season. And the 2 seasons he played for, I think it was the Oklahoma Bandits. So
Okay.
he gets signed. Only one guy calls him, and that's head coach Joe Gibbs of the Washington
Joe
Redskins,
Gibbs. Wow.
right? Because he
Because that's his boy.
remembers.
That's his boy.
He remembers. And so he talked to him. He said, "Are you okay coming in as a backup? Because Schrader's the guy. He's blonde. He's blue eyes. He didn't say those words, but that was the situation, right? So
Yes, sir.
Jay Schrader's in there as the starter, and he's in the backup. So by '87, I guess there were some injuries, and so he comes in, and like Schrader is injured, but then comes back, I think, and he has a couple of questionable games. Doug Williams gets the job, starts doing well, gets the fans on his side,
Nice.
and then he gets injured, and Schrader gets the job back, even
Mm.
though Williams, in time for the playoffs, is healthy. But
Oh,
Joe Gibbs sells him out and says he's our guy. He's going to be the starter. So Williams is phenomenally hurt by this because he knows the rules in football. Why is there a different set of rules for him? So it's like he's ticked, right?
gotcha.
And he knows the reasons, right? So,
Yes, sir.
anyways, so when Schrader falters, he gets his chance again. This time, he doesn't go back. He does not go back. So he gets Super Bowl 22. It's amazing, right? And he gets the famous question, how long have you been a black quarterback? Like, could there be a more asinine question in the history of sports journalism?
Ridiculous. Yeah.
And this is 1988 at this time, a full
These
on
things they be
1988.
progress. Yeah.
And we're speaking in terms, of
Yeah.
the echoes of segregation. Like quarterback and black quarterback, right? They're two different positions. So the question actually isn't illogical when you have that mindset that there are
Right.
quarterbacks and black quarterbacks. Not how long you've been a quarterback, but you're black. So how long have you been a black quarterback? Because it's separate from quarterback. Right? And it's but that's how crazy like white supremacy and all that type of prejudice and bigotry is. It puts you in these
Sure.
positions where you have to ask stupid questions, right? Because you're living in an illogical environment, right? So anyway, so he has to deal with this stuff. Now, it's a dramatic game. He's going against Denver, John Elway Denver, right? So he's in his own, he's got his own rise going on himself. He's got his own legend building himself, right? Tore up the
Right.
AFC. He was doing wonderfully, right? And they get into
Mm,
that game and they get out to like a 10-0 lead, something like that. And Williams has actually a really terrible looking injury, almost like a Robert Griffin Jr. kind of injury where he does the splits and like it's just bad. It
yeah.
looks bad. And he goes out for a
Right.
couple of plays while Schrader comes in, I think.
Mm,
No, wait, yeah, he had to go off for a couple of plays. But the important thing is he got up on his own strength. He got up off the
good.
turf, and it became that's important as you'll see later in the story. But
Mm,
anyways, he comes back 2 plays later after Schrader replaces him, goes into the second quarter, throws the most prolific quarter in perhaps football history, but certainly Super Bowl history, throws for
mm.
over 200 yards and 4 touchdowns to put the game away before halftime. Because this is what happened.
Wow.
This is what happens in the 80s, right? Is Super Bowl
Wow.
blowouts for a while. The only team that provided entertaining Super Bowls in the 80s were Cincinnati and the 49ers and the New
Wow.
York Giants, right? Like they're the only
Wow.
team, they're the only competitive Super Bowls in that whole damn decade. So yeah, you could have gone out at halftime and done something else and you wouldn't have missed anything. It was just a blowout after that. They scored 2 more
Incredible.
touchdowns and cruise, right? But the
Correct.
game is won in that quarter, and Doug Williams is the guy who does it. 228 yards, 0 picks, 4 touchdowns. That's a successful
Wow.
line, an entire game
Well,
for a
it
lot
is.
of people. And he does it in the Super Bowl. So not only does he become the first African American to start a Super Bowl, he's the first
Mm,
African American to win a Super Bowl, first African American to become Super Bowl MVP,
yes,
and,
sir.
and the only quarterback ever, black, white, pink, yellow, brown, right, to ever throw for
Mm,
4 touchdowns and 200 plus yards in a quarter, right? So
wow.
in his mind, he feels like he uses the words in the documentary. He says that he's done more than just have this outstanding game. Given the journey that he's had to go through, the barriers and the obstacles, he feels like he's had a Martin Luther King moment. He really feels like
Absolutely.
he felt like he had been to the mountaintop, not just in football, but for his personality, for his person and his people, right? Because
Mhm,
like
absolutely.
no, like you have put to bed, you would think
Yes.
any future
Sure.
questions about being African American and quarterback, right? You would figure, right?
Mm,
We come to
yeah.
find out later that it would take
It's
another
still
20
here.
years before it would take another 20 years before we really got to that point where people just stopped talking about it altogether, right? Because that's the goal, right? Like that's the goal. Like just
Of
talk about
course.
people as quarterbacks, not anything else. So he
Yeah.
does that. He wins 42-10. And Eddie Robinson has an emotional moment with him. He says to him, "You got up off the turf." Right? Because
Nice
apparently it
one.
referenced another moment earlier on back at Grambling too, or something, right? And so
Right.
yeah, it was huge for him. So it was a really, really he was just an amazing guy who did amazing things. And in his post career, he worked as an executive for both Tampa Bay and DC. Um, he's considered to be just a huge family guy. You heard it said a couple different times. He shows him at like family picnics.
Mm.
They're all wearing a T-shirt that says "We put the fun in dysfunctional." I want to go. I want to go to that family barbecue, man.
I'd slide
So
through too. I'd pull up.
right, so he's like the paterfamilias within this family, right? Like the most famous guy, obviously. He's got his own family and kids, but there's like 60, 70 people in this family barbecue picture, right? And he's like the
Oh,
top dog
yeah.
in them all. But to a man, they all say you'd never know. If you knew the guy, you'd never know. Like if you met him at that barbecue and you were family and you were talking to, you'd never know that this guy was an NFL legend,
He's a
right? He
regular
was
guy. He's chilling.
just a regular guy. He coached when he started coaching because he did some coaching too besides being an executive. He coached his
Yep.
own He coached Grambling to two championships
Ocean
to
Grambling. Yep.
step into Eddie Robinson's shoes. He coached his old high
Mhm.
school. He coached at
Wow.
Navy. Like
Wow.
he's had an amazing post career life. He's done a lot of things, and you'll never hear him trumpeting his horn. In fact, you want to hear another funny story from him growing up?
For
His
sure.
brother, his brother. I know we're going long here, but his brother, and it's
We're
all me,
going
right?
long. I accepted it. I accepted it. I accepted
His
it.
his
Listen.
brother is responsible for getting him into football. He wanted to play
Oh,
baseball. He was a softie. He looked at football and said, "It's too rough. I just want to play baseball. I got this great arm, right?" But his
yeah.
dad,
Yeah.
or not his dad, his older brother took over coaching, I guess, either the middle school or the local high school team or whomever. And he told him that, look, you got to play football. He's like, I don't want to play football, big brother. His big brother told me, he said, you got two choices. You can play football for me, or you can fight, or you can fight me. So I
Big
chose to
brother
play
shit.
football, right? And the funny thing is, that's not the first time I've heard a story like that from the South.
Yeah.
The Allman Brothers Band, it was sort of like an integrated, one of the very first integrated like rock and roll bands in the U.S. But they started out like they wanted to be a blues band, but then they turned into like they took a lot. It was the 60s, 70s, so they took a lot of like LSD and mushrooms and shit, and so their blues jams became 15 minutes long, and they had a whole different
Guys.
career, right? But when that band was formed, the leader of the band, Dwayne Allman, rest in peace, may he rest in peace. Once he was like the leader of that group. His younger brother Greg Allman like played all that type of stuff. But he told once they had their jam sessions and they got everybody in place, they found the right players. And so Dwayne Allman turns to the crew and says, "All right, so this is the band. These are the guys, right? Anybody who doesn't want to be in this band has to fight their way out of this room. Not just fight Dwayne. You got to fight everybody else in that room to leave if you want to leave, if you don't want to play for this band." So maybe it's a Southern thing. Maybe it's a Southern
Yeah,
motivational strategy. I don't know. But like, I
man.
thought that was amusing. Yeah, you got two choices. You can play for my band, you can play football, or you can fight your way out of this room. It's like,
Man, that's just old school guy mentality, man. We just fight it out
yeah,
in order to figure some shit out, man. You know what I
you
mean?
know what I mean? Fighting
That's
it
just
out to
guy
figure
stuff.
it out. That's
Sometimes it
right.
helps. Sometimes it's
Right.
real. And you know what?
So
Just to wrap everything up, is there any other anecdotes you have a little bit?
no, that's
Just
it.
those
That's
brief
it.
ones.
I
That's it.
emptied the clip, buddy. That's how we ended up
We
30
empty
minutes
the
of
clip.
overtime.
I'll say this. I like it. I like it. We're gonna be a little tighter next time, but if this type of story and this type of narrative is what you're getting from us, y'all, this is what you get,
Well,
and it's valuable because the story of Doug Williams, he
is
laid
a
down the
legend.
path for
It
GMs to accept and not just accept, but understand that regardless of your race, can the man play football? He can be black, white,
well,
yellow, don't matter. Will he give you wins? And the Redskins franchise went became a dynasty.